Welcome to Homegrown Tales, a live storytelling event held at Bews, 2 Piney Spring in Eureka Springs. The following was recorded February 7th, 2024. And now here's Zeek Taylor to introduce the program.
I'm so glad you're here. We welcome you to Homegrown Tales, a live storytelling show. All the stories are true that you'll hear tonight, so mostly true, okay. We're excited to have Janie Clark here as our guest storyteller.
We're thrilled tonight that Eureka Springs' own Pearl Brick is here as our special guest musician. Pearl's been a fixture on the Northwest Arkansas music scene for decades and is known for telling stories through her original songs. No stranger to the stage, she began performing in Nashville at the young age of 16. Now here's one of our town's favorite performers. Yeah, our friend Pearl Brick is here for Pearl.
I'm going to sing a song that I wrote about my oldest daughter. Her name is Kara, and some people here know her. She read Romeo and Juliet, Flagstaff to Kingman. She fell asleep with the complete works of Shakespeare in her arms. She's been older than me ever since she was 3. I tried not to ruin her. She got a wings you can't see. I love her bones, want her to come back home, nurse me until I'm gone. Oh, she gonna fly, no, I know she can fly higher than me.
Pearl will be back after our stories, and she'll be
Here
playing
for
more
hours.
She'll be playing more music for us, so stick around.
Yeah.
Okay, now on with the storytelling. Zeek Taylor is a recipient of the Arkansas Governor's Art Award for Lifetime Achievement. Best known as an artist, he's also a storyteller and a writer. He has performed on the NPR show Tales from the South. A StoryCorps interview with Zeek is on file in the Library of Congress, and a segment of the interview aired on NPR's Morning Edition. He's the author of 4 books that include Chimps Having Fun, Out of the Delta, the anthology. Zeek has also done film work and has appeared in commercials, documentaries, a short film, and a full-length feature film. He recently signed with Stage 28 Talent Casting. Here's Zeek.
The fast life. When I was a child, I couldn't wait for my mother to finish work on Saturday afternoons. When she got through, my family would get in the family car, and my father would drive us the 10 miles to the nearest Kroger in Pearl, Arkansas. And this was for our weekly grocery shopping. While she shopped, my younger sister and I would go spend the money that she gave us, and then we would rejoin my father, who never left the car. I knew he was nipping on Old Crow whiskey that he kept hidden under his seat. I could smell it on his breath when my sister and I returned. I enjoyed sitting in the car with my father because I thought he was the smartest man in the world. I believed that he knew just about everything because he could identify each automobile that passed by us on the street. He would say, "Here comes a Chevy," or "That's a Ford." Every now and then I would blurt out, "That one's a Pontiac." It was the only car I could identify with because of the car's distinctive hood ornament that depicted a stylized head of Chief Pontiac. My daddy was not brand loyal when it came to purchasing cars. However, he was color loyal and bought autos in his favorite color of pink. When I was in grade school, our family car was a 1952 Ford sedan that was pink with a cream-colored top and a fancy Hollywood tire on the rear bumper. The next car that my father bought was a pink 1957 Chevy station wagon that once again had a cream-colored top. By the time I was ready to drive, my father had purchased a coral pink 1959 Chevrolet Impala with a cream top. When he bought the car, it was far too wide and too long to park in our 1930s garage, so he built a large carport to house the new vehicle. Driver's education classes were not available when I was in high school. Many of my friends learned to drive out of necessity. They lived on farms where they drove work trucks or tractors, and as soon as their feet could touch the pedals, they were driving. One time a friend let me try my hand at driving his father's John Deere. I smashed part of a row of cotton. My friend and I both decided it would be best to wait till I learned to drive a car before I attempted to drive a tractor. Fortunately, his father wasn't mad at me for destroying some of the cotton plants, and he didn't ban me from riding on the tractor with his son. A year before I turned 16, I picked up a driver's manual from the DMV and began studying for the driver's exam. 6 months before I turned 16, my father began teaching me to drive on the hilly roads of Crowley's Ridge that bordered the west side of town. I was rather a small teen, and I could barely see over the steering wheel of the Impala. I had to sit on a couple of pillows so I could see the road through the windshield. To use one of my father's favorite expressions, the car was as long as a whore's dream, and that made it difficult for me to parallel park. I was glad the car wasn't automatic. I didn't have to manage a clutch pedal. That was one less thing I had to do with my feet. The car had power steering, but I still found it difficult to make the vehicle turn. The first time I tried to turn a corner, I ended up in a shallow ditch. My father was calm and patient with me. He seemed to enjoy our one-on-one time together while I learned to drive his beloved pink Impala. The day I turned 16, I took my driver's test. I had memorized the test booklet from cover to cover and made a perfect score on the written exam. The state trooper who administered the test was a large man who somewhat intimidated me with his size and authoritarian demeanor. He sat fairly close to me in the front seat of the Impala. I think he wanted to be able to grab the steering wheel if necessary. Even though I was nervous, I did fine on the driving part of the test until it came time to parallel park. I knocked over the flags that defined the parking area. The trooper said, "Close enough. You're trying to park a very long car." I passed and was the proud owner of a driver's license. In anticipation of receiving my license, I had managed to save $300 of money I had made picking cotton. Unlike my father, I didn't buy a pink one. I bought a baby blue 6-cylinder automatic 1952 Ford. I received my first parking ticket 2 weeks after I bought the automobile. One Saturday afternoon, my sister and I had been shopping in a nearby town, and we hurried home to watch the Miss America pageant on television. We didn't want to miss the opening parade of contestants representing each state, and we particularly wanted to see Miss Arkansas. She would be near the front of the lineup. I drove 90-0 to get home, and just as I pulled into my parents' driveway, a state trooper pulled in behind me with his patrol car lights flashing. I tried to explain the urgent need for me to hurry home. The state trooper did not accept my excuse. By the time I turned into the pageant, Miss Wyoming had already left the stage. From the kitchen window, my father had watched me receive the ticket. He told me that it was my problem and that I would be the one to pay the fine. He also told me that he hoped I had learned my lesson and I would no longer speed. I did not learn my lesson, and I've received many tickets for speeding since that time. While many of my friends drove 8-cylinder hot rods, I was very content cruising around in my little Ford. For a 6-cylinder, it was fairly peppy. Guys from my school often went down the highway to the mile crossing to drag race. The mile crossing was the first place on the highway where the road crossed over the Cotton Belt Railroad. If someone said, "Meet me at the mile crossing," they were going to race. I didn't stand a chance racing my car against hot rods. However, I knew that I stood a chance of winning at George Ray's drag strip in Paragould. George Ray's was a legal racing venue that was heavily attended on Sunday afternoons. And folks from several counties around the Delta came to view the races. Admission was charged to attend the half-day event. The paved racetrack was a quarter-mile long. 2 cars raced at a time when given the start signal by George Ray, who served as a flagman. There were several classifications for the competing cars depending on horsepower and whether a car had been altered or was stock. Stock meant the cars were exactly as they were when they left the factory and had not been altered or souped up. Letters denoted classifications, with AA assigned to the fastest and most powerful. AA stock was for the highest factory-rated horsepower cars. My little Ford was in the slowest stock category, in stock automatic. I didn't care that my car was in the slowest classification. It was in mint condition, and it was the fastest vehicle in its class. The little Ford never lost a race at the drag strip. The trophies were wooden with George Ray's drag strip engraved on the metal logo attached to the front of each one. There was a shiny silver metal automobile on the top. I displayed the trophies in my bedroom, and I couldn't have been more proud of them if they had been won while driving a Corvette in the AA class. Despite limitations, there are times when we can use what we got and still come out a winner. I need to add that in 2006, George's drag strip was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and George Ray passed away in 2009. And now I want to introduce my friend Sandra Spotts. Sandra has written for several Central Arkansas publications and made 12 appearances telling original stories on the internationally broadcast radio show Tales from the South. Sandra has a background in fine arts that began with work as a fiber artist. She has been an art teacher and has worked as a professional designer. For the past several years, she has called Eureka Springs home, where she continues her art career as an abstract expressionist painter. Here is Sandra.
This story is called Glenn and Me, The Road Trip. We met by default when I walked into my mall hair salon. Today, Glenn was taking up the slack for my absent stylist. Following the receptionist's instruction, I had a seat in the second chair and waited. After a couple of minutes, Glenn strolled in. In true late 1970s style, he out-Hamilled Dorothy Hamill with his wedge haircut and puffy sleeves. And he sported platform shoes. After exchanging greetings, he immediately started applying color recently necessitated by the few strands of gray invading my red hair. The banter flowed about a variety of subjects and was punctuated with lots of laughter. We hit it off. My color turned out the best it had in months. Little did I know, however, the hairstyle he gave me that day, much to my later frustration, would be the one I'd have and dislike for 30 years. He got in a huff the couple of times I cheated on him with other stylists. He explained my hair color had varied from strawberry blonde to mahogany over the last few months because Maureen decided to color and stop the processing whenever she had enough break time or whenever her soap opera ended. No timer was involved. That day, she became my former hairdresser. I returned a couple of times for Glenn to touch up my roots, and soon we were making plans to attend art receptions, go shopping, and meet for drinks. The friendship was sealed. We spent decades in conversations ranging from both sheer lunacy to emotional support through the losses of parents, his life partner, my divorces, and other heartaches life threw at us. We were always the first one the other called when tragedy struck. He went with me to the courthouse to act as my witness for 2 divorces, and each time we held a combination celebration and consolation session at the posh bar down the street. We lightened it up with discussion of how I should have flirted with the handsome judge, and he should have hit on the cute clerk. We concluded that divorce court was probably not the best place to attempt picking up new dates. Some of our other conversations went this way. Glenn: yesterday I found myself standing in my underwear, ironing with a cigarette hanging out of my mouth. I stopped cold, looked in the mirror, and said out loud, "My God, I've become white trash." Or me, mishearing his slight lisp: "I thought you just said you had a congealed weapon." Glenn: "Oh, only that apricot jello salad I took to Mother's on Easter. That was not good." I said concealed weapon, the one I found in my car. I was always the perfect second banana for Glenn. On one beautiful Sunday morning, Glenn called at 9:30, already speaking in a beery voice. "Throw the top down on the Z3 and come get me. We're going on a road trip." I complied, eager to hear what was up. Glenn shot out of the bungalow he shared with Jack, threw a 6-pack in the floor, and said more forcefully than usual, "Hit it." "All righty," I answered, "but where am I hitting it to?" "Let's go to Duval's Bluff and see Patty. I haven't seen her since she divorced that piece of crap and moved her kids back home. Just get on I-30 until I tell you to turn." Jack was in a snit this morning, and I didn't want to be griped at anymore. We spent the hour's drive enjoying the fresh air, filling it with our usual crazy banter, never again addressing the squabble that brought us here. Duval's Bluff is an old river town with a population of a few hundred, the kind of town with all of the stereotypes Hollywood loves to use as shorthand for the entire South: swampy riverbanks, abandoned storefronts, and dogs running loose. Perfect Southern Gothic. We stopped first at the legendary local barbecue shack and ate ourselves silly in pork sandwiches and coconut pie, then dragged our full bellies back to the car. Glenn directed me to the house Patty now shared with her 2 kids and her mother. She proudly showed off the salon she had opened in the detached garage. I halfway expected the cast of Steel Magnolias to come sashaying out. We visited for a while as Glenn subtly mined for assurances that Patty had a good business, and more importantly, that the piece of trash was no longer bothering her and she was safe. Just before sunset, we headed back to Little Rock with Motown tunes blasting from the radio. Glenn's mood began to lighten as we gossiped and laughed at whatever silliness we could conjure up. By the time I dropped him off, I had had one of my best days. His troubles were washed away by a little too much beer, some time and distance, and a road trip with the perfect second banana. Janie Clark came to Eureka Springs to visit friends and decided to stay. That was over 30 years ago. Florida born and bred, Janie is a career journalist who now makes stuff up. She writes a murder mystery series under the pen name Jane Elsey. She has recently finished book 4. Yay! Killer Croquet on the Emerald Isle, about 4 good friends, their adventures in Ireland, and the husband that winds up dead. The thing to know about her mystery series is this: the husband always dies. Following the show, Janie will have some of her books available for purchase. Here's Janie Clark.
Hey, y'all. Thank you for inviting me back. And so I don't usually write true tales. I like to make stuff up. But when you asked me again for the third or fourth time, do you have anything to read? I remembered that I do have something to read. When I lived in Orlando, a god-awful place for 25 years, I was part of a professional freelance writers organization. And I worked for Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, which is a big textbook publishing company. And we learned that the literacy community, which was very active in Florida at the time, the people that were trying to learn had no material that was adult level. So adults were reading Dick and Jane, and they were bored. And so we decided we would write some stuff that was at a better level, at a fourth grade level, but more adult-oriented, no smut. Too bad, but so we all put together a book of poems, fiction, nonfiction, journalism, all that kind of stuff. The Harcourt Brace Jovanovich and the Cablevision of Central Florida published it, and they published 10,000 books and donated them to the literacy program in throughout Florida, which was really cool. And one of the biggest thrills I had was going to a graduation program for one of these students' chapters, and having one of the students read my story aloud, and I sobbed in the background. So these are written at a fourth grade level, so I think you all can keep up. This one is called The Robe and the Spider. The sun was a gold haze in the blue June sky. The light touched the dew on the lawns of Chestnut Tree Drive and made them sparkle like a jeweler's shop window. It looked like a typical Saturday morning. At 1714 Chestnut Tree Drive, John McGregor's Saturday was starting out very typical. First of all, John McGregor loved his red silk bathrobe. He wore his robe every morning. He wore it every night. This was his custom for as long as he owned the robe, which was a good many years. On this Saturday morning, John McGregor was naked, except for his boxer shorts. He was without his favorite robe because he couldn't find it. So he was already upset when he went to the kitchen to make coffee. He had already measured the coffee grounds and put them in the basket. He'd already poured in the water and turned on the machine. He was just about to put the glass pot underneath to catch the coffee when he saw the spiders. John McGregor disliked spiders. John McGregor hated spiders. He feared spiders more than anything else that crept or crawled or swam or flew. By all other measures, John was a well-adjusted 49-year-old banking executive, except when it came to spiders. His fear, called arachnophobia, had been with him for most of his life. It began at the age of 5 when John had chickenpox. His older brother, Matt, had a passion for insects, spiders in particular. Matt kept his living treasures in a cigar box. The box, and everything in it, was the greatest gift Matt could think to give his sick and polka-dotted brother. While John slept, Matt tucked the box under his brother's arm. In Matt's eyes, this was 10 times better than a teddy bear. John was awakened by a nightmare, and in his dream he was being attacked by thousands of man-eating spiders. There were really only 7. The cigar box had come open, and the 7 spiders were set free. They were free to crawl where they chose. One of the spiders was sitting on the bridge of John McGregor's nose. That was when John's arachnophobia began, and he never outgrew it. At this exact moment in time, John McGregor was standing on the seat of his kitchen chair. He was screaming for his wife, Lee. He was still holding the glass pot to the coffee maker, and the machine was brewing coffee without the pot underneath it. Instead, it was brewing coffee all over the kitchen counter, all because there was a spider on the kitchen floor. This wasn't a small gray spider that might go unnoticed in the pattern of the floor tiles. This was a big, fat, hairy-looking monster with 2-inch legs. This spider was parked 3 feet from the leg of the chair on which John McGregor now stood screaming. The spider wasn't moving, but then neither was John. Lee understood that spider ridding was one of her most important roles as his wife, and as it was, she was now busy bopping at the spider with a broom. John watched in fear and ranted and raved from on top of the kitchen chair. The glass pot was still clutched tightly in his hands. No, this was not a typical Saturday morning at the McGregor's house on Chestnut Tree Drive. John McGregor couldn't find his favorite bathrobe. The spider had invaded his home. His coffee was not in his mug. It was all over the counter on a puddle on the floor. John McGregor might have gone back to bed. He might have pulled the covers up over his head. He might have, if he knew that things would get far worse as the day went on. In the mid-morning, when John discovered that his favorite bathrobe wasn't missing, it was gone. "How could you do that?" he asked his wife. "How could you throw away my robe?" He couldn't believe his wife could be so mean. Didn't she know how fond he was of his bathrobe? It was the best robe in the world. It was old and torn and smelling disgusting, Lika answered. "I gave you a new robe for Christmas." "I don't want to wear that new robe. I want my old one," John said. He knew he sounded childish. He didn't care. "I have that robe for 10 years. Lee put down the newspaper she was trying to read. She faced her husband defiantly. "That is exactly why I bought you a new one and threw the old one out." The tone of her voice sounded as if she was speaking to an unruly child. "It was worn out, John. Your new robe looks just like the other one, only it isn't worn out." Lee snapped the newspaper open and continued reading. "I think that was inconsiderate," he mumbled. "You shouldn't have thrown away my robe in the trash." "You're being silly," Lee replied from behind the newspaper. "I am not." "You are too." "I am not," John McGregor bellowed. He slammed his cup on the table and marched from the room. At the door he turned and added, "And I'm not going to wear the new one, so there." What a day, he thought. He walked out to his cactus garden. It was one of his favorite places. Maybe it would make him feel better, he thought. John McGregor's hobby was growing cactus. Actually, he collected cacti because cactus pretty much grows itself. This was why it was such an enjoyable hobby. With very little effort, his cactus garden flourished. There wasn't much to be done in his garden. He pulled a few weeds from between the rocks, and he went from plant to plant, admiring the thick green flesh. He admired the bright-colored flowers and looked as if they were made of wax, and he started to feel better. He decided that perhaps he might forgive Lee for throwing out his red silk bathrobe, and he might wear the new one. And then he noticed that she was gone, and he wondered where she was. "Where have you been?" he demanded when she came through the door. Some time later, he kissed her on the cheek. "Phew, you stink. Where have you been?" "At the dump." Lee pulled a strand from her hair from her forehead with a dirty hand. "The dump? As in the garbage dump?" "Yes, it's a nasty place." John finally caught on. He smiled a flashing, hopeful smile. Lee shook her head. "Junk and birds. Thousands of screaming, swooping birds." "But no bathrobe," John said. "No bathrobe," Lee agreed. "I love you for trying," he said softly. He stepped forward to hug her. He changed his mind because she smelled like the dump, and then he changed his mind again and hugged her anyway. "I bought you something," Lee said. "A peace offering." She stepped back on the front porch and picked up the gift. "It's a cactus," he exclaimed. "A very rare cactus," she said, and handed him the potted plant. It was tall and squat and dark, dark green. "I know just where to put it," he said. His eyes shone with joy. "Thanks, Lee," he said, and put the pot on the floor in the living room. They were sitting on the sofa, sipping a 6 o'clock cocktail, and they watched the sun sink in the sky. He wasn't angry anymore. He missed his robe, but he knew he would get over it. In fact, they laughed at all the things that had happened that day, and it made them feel the bond of love that made their marriage so great. The cactus was on the floor nearby, and John eyed it proudly. It was proof of Lee's love. He glanced fondly at the cactus, and then he glanced fondly at his wife. And then a movement caught his attention, and he looked back at the cactus. And certainly he imagined what he thought he saw. A cactus didn't move. This one did. Not across the floor or anything. The cactus was breathing. John stared. He couldn't believe what he saw. "Lee?" he asked. She followed his gaze. "What in the—" She broke off in disbelief. The cactus was indeed breathing. The flesh expanded and then relaxed. It grew like a balloon being inflated, and then it shrunk as if the air was slowly let out. In, out. Take a breath, let it out. Then the cactus took a long, slow breath. It grew wider and wider, and suddenly it exploded. And bits and pieces of cactus pulp fell to the floor around the pot. And John McGregor screamed. Hundreds of baby spiders scattered from inside the cactus. An army of tiny tarantulas crawled over the wasted plant, over the pot, down the pot, onto the floor. John's face turned white, his eyes glazed over with fear. The floor beneath the pot was peppered with tiny spiders. "Raid!" Lee yelled. "Get the raid!" she screamed. John McGregor didn't move. He couldn't move. He was paralyzed with fear. Lee jumped up from the sofa, and her foot struck the table. She tripped, and down she went, and her head struck the coffee table as she fell. She lay there unmoving. Her arms were sprawled on the floor, her fingers stretched only inches from the pot. The spiders were crawling toward her. "Lee!" he screamed. "Get up! The spiders are coming!" She couldn't move. She didn't move. The blow to her head had knocked her unconscious. In a flash, he realized he was on his own. He and hundreds of spiders. His wife lay unconscious on the floor. A memory from his past flashed in his mind. He remembered a nightmare of man-eating spiders, and a lump of fear caught in his throat. He forced his legs to move, and in one quick leap, he reached his wife. With a swoop, he picked her up and laid her on the sofa. And then he danced. Like an Irishman's jig, like a scatman's tap, he danced and he stomped and he danced and he stomped on every inch of the floor around the pot. On every spider he saw, crush, criss, squish, crunch. And when he stopped, not a single spider moved. Sweat poured from his forehead. His stomach was knotted with nausea, and the spiders were dead. John McGregor had fought the spiders and won, all by himself. John and Lee McGregor made the Sunday edition of their newspaper that week. The article reported that Lee was recovered. The doctor had said her injury wasn't serious. The article reported that the nursery where Lee bought the plant took full responsibility. They would pay to have the house exterminated. The cactus had been taken from the desert, which is where cacti grow. Tarantulas, who also live in the desert, and in the wild, the female spider often makes a tunnel underneath the cactus. She tunnels into the center of the plant, then lays her eggs inside where it's cool and dark and safe from predators. When the young spiders hatch, their movement inside the cactus weakens it until it cracks open and they can escape. The reporter for the newspaper told of John's dancing with a touch of humor. From the encyclopedia, the reporter learned that long ago it was believed the bite of a tarantula caused a strange and nervous disease. The only cure for this disease was a rapid, whirling, stomping dance. John McGregor laughed when he read that in the newspaper. How idiotic he must have looked dancing that rapid, whirling, stomping dance. John tightened the sash on his new red silk bathrobe, the one Lee had given him for Christmas. He decided the robe really was nice. It was new, not torn or faded. It just looked like the other one. It felt very much like the other one. He decided he could become his new favorite bathrobe. He smiled at his wife and then set his cup of coffee on the table. And that's when he saw the spider crawling across the floor. Thank you.
Please welcome Janie back to the stage.
So last time I read the story about my grandma and her Eastern Star event with a wad of chewing tobacco in her mouth. It didn't go very well, did it? I mean, the story went well, but the poor Jesus, Jesus had spittle on his face. Anyway, I'm going to read another of Grandma's yarns. I loved my grandmother. She was 4'2" and spit fire. She could tell you to sit down, young lady, and by God, you would sit down. And those of you who know me know that that does not work with me very much. Yeah, what? So this is called Grandma's Yarn About Peg-Leg Jones. Every summer I went to visit my grandma. She lived in a little town in North Florida called Archer, right outside of Gainesville, for those of you who know geography. There are 3 churches and an Eastern Star meeting hall in Archer. The railroad track goes up the middle of town like a spine. The country store, drugstore, post office, and firehouse are all on one side of the track. On the other side is the rail yard, where every weekday the whistle blows at noon and 5 o'clock sharp. My grandmother's house was old even when I was young. As long as I can remember, its tin roof was a pretty red, rusted color. In the yard there were many oak trees and pecan trees, which they fought over all the time. They shaded Grandma's prize-winning azaleas. Her house had lots of windows that let in the fresh air, and some of the windows looked out onto a field of wildflowers that bloomed all summer long. There was also a big patch of wild blackberries. We called them dewberries, and Grandma made the best dewberry pie. Boy, they get in your teeth, something terrible. Yeah. None of this has anything to do with Grandma's story about Peg-Leg Jones, except that the story takes place in Archer and in Grandma's house. On Sundays after church, we ate a big dinner, and for some reason, Sunday dinner at Grandma's tasted better than it did anywhere else. There was always rice and gravy, there were fresh vegetables from her garden, and homemade pies and cakes for dessert. And after our bellies were full and our eyes were sleepy, we retired to the front porch. We rocked on the rocking chairs and sipped sweet iced tea. And that's when Grandma would tell her tales. She called it spinning yarns, and this is one of my favorites. During the Depression, Grandma rented out the back bedroom of the house to help pay bills. Her first and only boarder was a man known as Pegleg Jones. Mr. Jones was a big man. He was about knee-high to a cypress tree, or 6 feet 5 inches. He had a barrel chest and muscular arms. His face was wide and covered with salt and pepper gray beard. He had a small patch of gray hair on top of his head, but he kept it covered with an old sailor's cap. The most unusual thing about Mr. Jones was that he had a wooden peg leg. No one in town knew how Mr. Jones lost his leg, but everyone had an opinion on the subject. They talked about it at the post office when they collected their mail. They discussed it with the druggist when they stopped in for some remedy, and they gossiped outside the Archer grocery over a bottle of Coca-Cola. Some said his leg got bit off by an alligator. Some said it was a shark. Only a few were brave enough to ask him, and when asked, Mr. Jones would crack a smile, and then he would say, "Yep, she's gone, that's all there is to know." Pegleg Jones kept to himself. No one knew where he was from, and no one knew what he had done with his life. No one knew his first name either. He was just Pegleg, except my grandma knew it, and she kept that secret. Mr. Jones paid his rent on time. He didn't drink, that anyone ever saw, and that suited my grandma just fine. It wasn't long after the new school teacher came to town that Pegleg Jones found religion. Or at least he started attending services at the Archer Baptist Church. Miss Sarah Jane Russell, which incidentally we have a Sarah Jane Russell here, was the new teacher's name, and she sang in the church choir. There was no sweeter voice in all the county, or so it was said, and Mr. Jones must have agreed because he was there every Sunday to hear Miss Sarah Jane sing. One thing led to another, as most things usually do, and Mr. Jones started courting Miss Russell in the most proper and gentlemanly manner. Twice Grandma saw Pegleg Jones picking wildflowers from her field, and soon after that a rumor began to spread. It was said that they would marry if Pegleg Jones got the courage to ask for her hand. Grandma started those rumors. But it never came to be. In the summer of that year, a revival came to Archer. With it came a big red and white striped tent and a tall, handsome preacher. Grandma said that preacher preached so sweet he could talk the wings from an angel. Every night for a week, the entire town gathered under the tent. They sang and preached and sang, and every night Miss Russell sang with them. When the revival left town and the big tent and handsome preacher was taken down, Sarah Russell went with it. Grandma's eyes always opened wide when she got to this part in her story. She'd lower her voice really soft, and we'd have to stop listening. We'd have to stop rocking to hear what she had to say. Every night, when the grandfather clock struck 11 and everyone was asleep, Pegleg Jones would rise from his bed. Creak! The door would open. He'd come out of the room and into the breezeway that connected his room to the rest of the house, and he paced until the stroke of midnight. Up and down, the boards beneath him sounded hollow in the still of the night. His footsteps echoed through the house. Thump, clack, thump, thump, clack, thump. His left foot, thump. His peg leg and crutch, clack, thump. Foot, peg, crutch, thump, clack, thump. Turn, thump, clack, thump. For an hour. Then this went on for weeks. Every night, Pegleg Jones paced the breezeway until the stroke of midnight, and Grandma got so used to it, the rhythm put her to sleep faster than rain on the old tin roof. And then one night, even though it was past 11 o'clock, the house was completely silent. There was no thump. There was no clack thump. There was nothing, just silence. And Grandma crept from her bed and peeked into the breezeway. There was no Pegleg Jones in the shadows. She tiptoed through to his bedroom and put her ear to the door. There was no Pegleg Jones snoring. She knocked softly. There was no answer. She knocked again and then turned the knob and entered. A full moon made the room bright enough to see that the bed was empty. The moon made it bright enough to see that the crutch still leaned against the wall near his bed. It was bright enough to see that there was just no Mr. Jones. He had vanished into the thin air of that moonlit summer's night. Grandma kept his clothes in the dresser for a long time, and she left his crutch by the wall until the spiders spun webs around it. But no one in Archer ever saw or heard from Pegleg Jones again, or Sarah Jane Russell for that matter. Some believe Pegleg Jones hopped the train at the rail yard, that he went looking for Miss Russell and her preacher, and Lord knows what he'd do when he found them, the postmistress would proclaim. She's a nosy bitty body, isn't she? And anyway, and everyone would shake their heads. Lord only knows, they agree. The owner of the drugstore said Pegleg Jones probably put back to sea on a tramp steamer. He figured Pegleg went off to see the rest of the world and lose the other leg. Grandma had a different story. Most people liked hers best. She said that God had mercy on poor Pegleg Jones. She believed he died of a broken heart, pure and simple. She believed that God's angels took Mr. Jones to heaven that night, carried him to heaven lock, stock, and barrel. But every now and then, Grandma said, when the moon was full and the night was quiet, Pegleg Jones would return, and many times she'd lain in bed and heard that thump, clack, thump, thump, clack, thump, turn.
Let's hear it again for Janie. We're so glad she was here tonight. I'd now like to welcome back to the stage my friend Sandra Spotts.
Well, this is just a bit of a Valentine story. It's called The Eyes Have It. I drew in a breath when I walked into Dr. Becker's biology class. It had been a hectic week getting settled into college life. Entering, I spied a male body with an incredible set of eyes, looking all Ricky Nelson, James Dean, and Elvis-y. Eyes bigger than a doe's with lashes long as moth wings. I cleverly chose a desk one row over and a few seats back from the eyes and the body that housed them. It was a great post from which to gaze rather than listen about protozoa and such. Had those eyes not shown up, maybe my grade would have been an A in biology rather than a B. It was clear that when the semester's lectures turned to the study of hormones, I would learn more from staring at that face than Dr. Becker could ever teach me. Thoughts on my walk back to the dorm turned to strategizing. How could I possibly meet Mr. Dreamy Eyes? My shyness and ingrained list of things girls don't do ruled out the possibility of simply approaching him after class and starting a conversation. The walk yielded no solution, so I turned my thoughts to the blind date my future brother-in-law had orchestrated. During the summer, Rob, my brother-in-law, had worked at a photo processing lab in our hometown. He had shown a photo of the young, cute me to a buddy who was interested in a blind date, the way we met people before online dating. The summer was coming to a close without our finding a time to go out, so we decided to plan a date when we were at the university. We shared a quick phone call and arranged a date for the weekend. We would go to the movies to see Dr. Zhivago, possibly one of the most romantic films of all time. I waited in the dorm lobby for Rob's friend to pick me up. I occupied myself by watching which guys walked out with which girls. Finally, 15 minutes late, the glass door was flung open, and there he was. Mr. Dreamy Eyes entered, glanced at a small paper rectangle he carried, and walked straight toward me. He held up the photo that Rob had given him to spot me. Seems that fate and a good matchmaker, future brother-in-law, had given me an easy path through my shyness. There he was, and we were going out. Mr. Dreamy Eyes was as cute and charming and funny as I had fantasized. We hit it off and spent the semester having fun, attending football games, dances, and parties, all the typical leisure activities of college. Timing, however, was never on our side. While at a dance, we ran into a very huggy and very tipsy little sister of his former girlfriend. Then, over the holidays, he had a car wreck and stitches in his face. Eventually, he and Huggy Girl began to date. He eventually married Huggy Girl. I married. He divorced. He remarried. I divorced. I remarried. We hopscotched our way through life, occasionally running into each other, having lunch and catching up on our lives. We were always at different places along the married-divorce trail. Years later, I met Huggy Girl, and we became friends through our mutual activities as artists and our connections to Mr. Dreamy Eyes. She regretted divorcing him and blamed her own immaturity. I regretted we had ever run into her at that dance. We dubbed ourselves the girlfriends-in-law. The last time I ran into Dreamy was at a grocery store when we were in our 60s. We talked for the first time about our near misses and how we both regretted them. He was frail and had a slight tremor, but he still had those eyes. My knees still got shaky when we talked. Soon after, I ran into girlfriend-in-law who told me he had ALS. He soldiered on for 10 years with the loving care of his second wife, who was a nurse. At the end of our conversation, my thoughts swirled about how the precious days of youth sift through our fingers while we speed toward adulthood, how opportunity that can change our life's path is wasted through fear and hesitancy, how happenstance can change our fate, and how we can, through a lifetime, continue to be captivated by the charm of dreamy eyes. And here is Zeek again.
This is the last story of the evening, and it's called Keep On Dancing. One of the first dances I learned to do was the Charleston. My mother, Ellen Taylor, was born in 1913. She lived during the Roaring '20s, the era when the Charleston was popular, and she is the one who taught me the dance. She grew up in a progressive family, and that was unusual considering that they lived in northeast Arkansas Delta. Her father, Arzo Harvey, wanted his family to live a modern lifestyle. Even though he had only an 8th grade education, my grandfather kept up with popular culture by reading magazines. One evening after he got home from his job at a dry goods store, he told his wife and daughters that he was going to cut their hair. He had seen a magazine that day featuring the latest flapper haircuts. The haircuts were very short and at the time were considered to be shocking and too manly for women to wear. He cut off his daughter's hair and my grandmother's hair. They were the talk of the town for weeks. Besides wanting his family to look fashionable, Arzo wanted them to take advantage of modern fads, and that included dancing. The Charleston was the dance of the day, and he learned to do it. He taught it to my mother, and many years later, she taught it to me. My mother, like her father, wanted her children to be modern and know the latest dances. My father said that my sisters and I would be socially handicapped when we started college if we didn't know how to dance. My parents enrolled my 2 sisters and me in ballroom dance classes at the Westbrook School of Dance in nearby Paragould. When I turned 10, and for the next several years, my parents took us to weekly classes. I loved to dance. In addition to ballroom, I learned other dances. Like the new dance craze, the bob, I taught my mother to bob, and she taught the dance to my father. Once a month on a Saturday night, my parents dressed and went to the Kingsway Supper Club to dine and dance. The night they returned home after going to the supper club and dancing the bob, she could barely contain her excitement when she told me about taking the floor while dancing to Rock Around the Clock. I was never much of an athlete, and I was relieved that I was able to take dance classes to fulfill my physical education requirements at Arkansas State University. I made an A in choreography and an A in ballroom dance. I was thrilled that I had made such good grades in both PE classes. Physical education had never been an area where I had excelled. And there were 3 young ladies and 2 other guys in my college ballroom dance class. During the semester, the class was asked to provide the halftime entertainment at one of the university's basketball games. My instructor said that to receive a grade, we had to do the performance. We were to perform a waltz to the Blue Danube by the Austrian composer Johann Strauss II. I was nervous before I entered the shiny basketball court, while wearing a blousy shirt and white stirrup dance pants. I didn't know how we would be received, and I was afraid we would be jeered. The crowd loved us. I thought it ironic that my daddy would be proud that I was cheered on a college basketball court, although not quite the way that he had wanted it to happen. Years later, while attending the Memphis College of Art, I received a full scholarship to study and perform with Ballet South. I had art classes during the day and dance classes at night. I studied with George Latimer, who had been a principal dancer with the San Francisco Ballet, and Daniel Baracheski of the Royal Winnipeg Ballet. Many years earlier, I had learned the Charleston in my mother's beauty shop on an old linoleum rug. In Memphis, I danced on a stage where Rudolph Nureyev and Margot Fontaine had performed. Every time I dance, I think of my mother. And thank you, everyone, and thank you for coming, and thanks for Bews once again for hosting us. And thanks again to Janie and Pearl for wonderful music. And now Sandra will tell us about our next show.
Our next show will be here the first Wednesday in April. I believe it's the 3rd, and our guest will be Shabana Kauser. She has been here before. She's an artist in Northwest Arkansas and has had a wonderful life experience, and she's a wonderful writer and storyteller as well. So we're looking forward to having her here and hope you join us.
You've been listening to Homegrown Tales, a live storytelling event held at Bews, 2 Pinted Spring in Eureka Springs. Join us again next time for more Homegrown Tales.